Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Dr. Elizabeth. Let's start with something almost every single one of us has felt. You wash your face, maybe it's your morning routine, maybe it's after a long day, maybe it's just splashing water on your face before bed, and within a few minutes your skin starts to feel tight. Almost like it's being gently pulled from the inside, like a sheet stretched a little too far across a bed. Some people even describe it as feeling squeaky clean, as if that tightness is proof the cleanser really worked, the way a freshly washed window squeaks under your fingers. I want to challenge that idea today because it's one of the most common and most misunderstood sensations in all of skincare. Tightness after washing feels familiar, almost normal, and a lot of people have quietly assumed it means their face is finally properly clean. Some people even chase that feeling on purpose, using stronger cleansers or washing more often because tightness has become, in their mind, a signal of success. So today, let's talk about this deeply. What's actually happening on your skin in those minutes after you rinse? Why that tight feeling isn't necessarily a good sign, and what the evidence actually tells us about it. To understand tightness, we have to go back to something we've covered before on this channel, the skin barrier. If you've watched our earlier videos, you already know the outermost part of your skin, the epidermis, has a structure often described using a bricks and mortar model. The bricks are flattened skin cells. The mortar is a mixture of lipids, fats like ceramides, cholesterol, and fatty acids that fills the gaps between those cells and holds the whole structure together. This bricks and mortar layer has two main jobs: keeping irritants and microbes out and keeping water in. It's a structure we've spent time on before, precisely because so much of what people experience day to day with their skin, tightness, sensitivity, dullness, traces back to how well this one layer happens to be functioning at any given moment. That second job, keeping water in, is really the center of today's conversation. Your skin naturally contains a certain amount of water, held there partly by this lipid mortar, and partly by what's called natural moisturizing factor, a collection of water-attracting substances inside the skin cells themselves, including amino acids, urea, and various salts. Together, the lipid mortar and the natural moisturizing factor act like a sponge with a lid on it. The natural moisturizing factor helps draw water in and hold onto it, while the lipid layer acts as that lid, slowing down how quickly water can escape into the surrounding air. When you wash your face, you're not just removing dirt, oil, and product residue. You're also, to some degree, interacting with this lipid layer, and by extension with the lid that's been keeping water from evaporating too quickly. And that's where the story of tightness really begins. Cleansers work because they contain surfactants, ingredients specifically designed to break down oil and grab onto it so it can be rinsed away with water. Surfactant molecules have a structure that allows one end to attach to oil and the other end to attach to water, which is what makes it possible to rinse away oily residue that water alone wouldn't be able to remove on its own. This is exactly why cleansers are effective at removing makeup, sunscreen, and the day's accumulated oil and grime. But surfactants aren't perfectly selective. Along with the oil and dirt you want removed, many surfactants also strip away some of the skin's own natural lipids, the very mortar holding that brick wall together. The stronger the surfactant and the longer or more vigorously it's used, the more of that natural lipid layer tends to be removed in the process. This is the mechanism most commonly associated with that tight, squeaky clean feeling. When some of the lipid barrier is temporarily stripped away, the skin's ability to hold onto water is reduced. Water molecules that would normally be retained near the surface evaporate more quickly, in a process researchers refer to as transepidermal water loss. As that water leaves and the barrier is temporarily thinner than usual, nerve endings near the surface of the skin can register that change as a pulling or tightening sensation. It's not your imagination, and it's not usually dangerous, but it's also not really a sign that your face has been thoroughly and properly cleaned. It's more accurately a sign that some of your skin's own protective lipids came along for the ride. It helps to understand why this happens more with some cleansers than others. Foaming cleansers, in particular, often rely on stronger surfactants to create that lather people associate with deep cleaning. The foam itself doesn't actually clean any better than a non-foaming formula. Foam is essentially a cosmetic effect, a texture people have learned to associate with effectiveness, much the same way toothpaste doesn't need to foam to remove plaque effectively. But the surfactants that produce a rich lather are frequently more effective at stripping lipids too, which is part of why heavily foaming cleansers are more commonly associated with post-wash tightness than gentler, low-foam or cream-based formulas. Water temperature plays a role here as well. Hot water tends to be more effective than cool or lukewarm water at dissolving and removing oils, which might sound like a good thing, but it also means hot water is more likely to strip away more of the skin's natural lipid layer along with everything else. This is part of why dermatologists generally recommend lukewarm water for cleansing rather than very hot water, even though hot water can feel more satisfying, especially in colder months or after a stressful day when a hot shower feels like part of the wind-down routine. How long and how vigorously you cleanse matters too. Extended scrubbing or aggressively rubbing a cleanser into the skin for an extended period gives surfactants more contact time and more mechanical action to work with, both of which can increase how much of the lipid barrier gets removed. There's a common assumption that more friction equals a deeper clean, similar to scrubbing a dirty dish, but skin isn't a dish, and that same logic doesn't transfer well to something as thin and biologically active as the epidermis. A shorter, gentler cleansing motion is generally considered sufficient for most everyday cleansing needs, without requiring the kind of prolonged scrubbing that some people assume is necessary to feel truly clean. Frequency is another factor worth mentioning. Washing your face many times throughout the day, beyond what's generally recommended, gives the skin barrier less time to recover between cleanses. Most dermatologists generally suggest cleansing once or twice daily for most skin types, though this can vary based on individual factors like activity level, sweat, and skin type. Washing far beyond that frequency doesn't necessarily make skin cleaner in any meaningful sense. It just increases the number of times the lipid barrier is disturbed, which over the course of a day can add up to a fairly significant cumulative effect on how much of that protective lipid layer remains intact. It's also worth mentioning that cleansing isn't the only step that can contribute to this sensation. Exfoliating products, whether physical scrubs or chemical exfoliants like alpha-hydroxy acids and beta-hydroxy acids, work in part by loosening or dissolving some of the connections between skin cells at the surface. Used appropriately, this can be a genuinely useful part of a skincare routine, supporting the same cell turnover process we've discussed in earlier videos. But exfoliation used too frequently or layered directly before or after a cleanser with strong surfactants can compound the same lipid stripping effect we've been discussing, making post-wash tightness feel more intense than it would from cleansing alone. This is part of why dermatologists generally recommend introducing exfoliating products gradually and paying attention to how skin responds, rather than assuming more frequent exfoliation is automatically better. Environmental conditions play a role here too, and this is something a lot of people notice seasonally without necessarily connecting it back to cleansing. Cold, dry outdoor air holds less moisture to begin with, and indoor heating during colder months tends to lower indoor humidity even further, sometimes to levels closer to what you'd find in a desert climate. When the surrounding air is already dry, water evaporates from the skin's surface more readily after washing, which can make that post-cleansing tightness feel more pronounced in winter than it does in more humid conditions. This is one of the reasons some people notice their skin behaves differently across seasons, a topic connected to something we'll explore further in a future video about how skin changes throughout the year. I'll mention something from my own experience here because I think it illustrates this well. Years ago, before I fully understood the mechanics behind this, I used to associate that tight, squeaky feeling with having done a thorough job cleansing, especially after a long day. It wasn't until I started paying closer attention to how my skin behaved over the following hours, noticing that the tightness was often followed by a bit more oil production later in the day, especially in the T-zone, that I started questioning whether that clean feeling was actually working in my favor. Switching to a gentler, lower foaming cleanser and lukewarm water made a noticeable difference over a few weeks, not in some dramatic overnight way, but in how consistently comfortable my skin felt throughout the day, and I stopped reaching for a stronger cleanser every time I felt like my skin needed a deeper clean. Now, here's an important nuance. A small amount of temporary tightness right after washing is extremely common and, for most people, resolves within a few minutes as the skin's natural processes begin working to restore balance, especially once moisturizer is applied. This kind of brief, mild tightness isn't typically something to worry about. What's more worth paying attention to is tightness that lingers well beyond washing, that shows up even without washing at all, or that's accompanied by other signs we discussed in an earlier video: increased sensitivity, rough texture, or unusual reactivity to products. That pattern is more commonly associated with a barrier that's under more significant, ongoing stress, rather than just a normal, momentary response to cleansing. One simple way to get a general sense of how your cleanser is behaving is to pay attention to the timeline. If tightness fades within roughly 10 to 15 minutes on its own, without needing anything applied, that's generally consistent with a normal, temporary response. If it persists well beyond that window, or if it's present most of the day regardless of when you last washed your face, that's more suggestive of an ongoing imbalance worth addressing, whether through a gentler cleanser, adjusted technique, or a broader look at your overall routine. This isn't a formal diagnostic test, just a simple, low-effort way of noticing your own skin's pattern over time. This is a topic where a lot of well-meaning but genuinely inaccurate advice still tends to circulate rather widely. So let's go through it carefully, one myth at a time. Myth 1. If your skin doesn't feel tight after washing, the cleanser isn't working properly. This is probably the most widespread misconception connected to this whole topic, and it's one that's been reinforced for decades by marketing language promising a deep clean or a squeaky clean feel. Tightness isn't a marker of effective cleansing. It's more accurately a sign of lipid stripping. A cleanser can remove oil, dirt, makeup, and sunscreen thoroughly without leaving skin feeling tight at all. In fact, many dermatologists generally consider a cleanser that doesn't leave skin feeling tight to be doing a gentler and often more skin-friendly job. The absence of tightness doesn't mean a cleanser failed. It often means the formulation was better balanced for the skin's natural lipid layer, allowing it to remove impurities without taking the lipid mortar along with them. Myth 2. Tight skin means your skin is oil-free and clean. Tightness reflects reduced water content near the surface, not the absence of oil specifically. In fact, tightness can sometimes trigger a rebound effect. Some research and clinical observation suggests that stripping the skin's natural oils can, in certain people, prompt oil glands to produce more sebum to compensate, particularly with repeated over-cleansing. This is sometimes described anecdotally as skin trying to correct for the loss of its protective lipid layer by ramping up oil production, though the exact mechanisms and how consistently this occurs can vary from person to person. So, tight skin isn't necessarily oil-free skin. It may just be skin that's temporarily lost some of its water-retaining lipid structure, and depending on the person, that can sometimes be followed by more oil production rather than less, which is part of why some people who over-cleanse in an effort to control oiliness end up noticing more oil later in the day rather than less. Myth 3. Everyone's skin should feel exactly the same after cleansing. Skin type plays a meaningful role in how noticeable this sensation is. People with naturally drier skin, or skin with a less robust lipid barrier to begin with, often notice tightness more intensely and for longer after cleansing than people with naturally oilier skin, who may have more lipid production to begin with and may not notice tightness as strongly. This connects directly to something we discussed in an earlier video about why everyone's skin is a little different. Genetics, hormones, environment, and lifestyle all shape how much natural oil your skin produces to begin with, which in turn shapes how a given cleanser will feel on your particular skin. Neither experience is inherently right or wrong. It reflects genuine differences in baseline skin biology, not a difference in how well someone is following a routine. Myth 4. Natural or chemical-free cleansers can't cause tightness. Tightness is generally driven by the type and concentration of surfactants in a formula, along with water temperature and cleansing technique, not by whether ingredients are labeled as natural, organic, or synthetic. Plenty of naturally derived surfactants are just as capable of stripping lipids as synthetic ones, and plenty of synthetic formulas are specifically engineered to be gentle. The natural versus synthetic framing doesn't reliably predict how a cleanser will affect your skin's barrier, and it's worth being skeptical of marketing that implies otherwise. Myth 5. Tightness means your skin has been purified or detoxed. This is a phrase that shows up a lot in skincare marketing, and it isn't grounded in how skin biology actually works. Skin doesn't accumulate toxins that a cleanser needs to draw out through some kind of purifying reaction, and the tight sensation isn't evidence of that happening. It's simply a physical response to reduced water content near the surface, tied to the mechanisms we've already discussed. Framing it as detoxification adds a layer of mystique to something that has a much more straightforward, well-understood explanation. So what should you actually do with this information? First, if you regularly experience noticeable, lingering tightness after washing, it's worth looking at your current cleanser and considering whether a gentler, lower foaming, or cream-based formula might be a better fit for your skin's needs. This isn't about assuming your current cleanser is bad. Plenty of people use a stronger cleanser occasionally, for example after heavy makeup or sunscreen, without issue. It's about recognizing that different formulas interact differently with different skin types, and that the product you reach for daily is worth matching to how your particular skin tends to respond, rather than defaulting to whatever's popular or heavily marketed. Second, water temperature is a simple, low-effort variable to adjust. Using lukewarm rather than hot water is a small change that many people find reduces the intensity of post-wash tightness without requiring any change in products at all. This is often one of the easiest adjustments to make since it costs nothing and doesn't require researching or purchasing anything new, just a slightly different habit at the sink. Third, consider your cleansing technique and duration. A gentle, relatively brief cleanse, enough to remove makeup, sunscreen, and the day's buildup, is generally sufficient for most people, without needing extended scrubbing that increases surfactant contact time. Using your fingertips in soft circular motions for something like 30 seconds to a minute is generally considered adequate for most everyday cleansing, rather than the longer, more vigorous scrubbing some people assume is necessary. Fourth, pay attention to frequency. If you're cleansing more than twice a day without a specific reason like heavy sweating or a particular skin concern discussed with a dermatologist, it may be worth reconsidering whether that frequency is giving your skin's barrier enough time to recover between washes. For some people, a simple water rinse in the middle of the day, rather than a full cleanse, can be enough to feel refreshed without repeatedly disturbing the lipid barrier. Fifth, and this is one of the more practically useful habits, apply moisturizer relatively soon after cleansing while skin is still slightly damp. This timing is generally recommended because it can help support the skin's ability to retain some of the water that's naturally present right after washing, before it has a chance to evaporate as quickly. We'll cover moisturizer application in more detail in a future video, but it's worth mentioning here because it directly connects to the tightness we're discussing today. Sixth, if you use exfoliating products, consider spacing them out from your regular cleansing routine rather than combining strong exfoliants with a stripping cleanser on the same day. Giving your skin a day or two between more intensive steps can reduce the cumulative lipid stripping effect and make that tight, uncomfortable sensation less likely to show up. And seventh, during colder, drier months, it may be worth adjusting your routine slightly to account for the lower humidity. Perhaps leaning toward a gentler cleanser or being a little more consistent about moisturizing promptly after washing, since the environment itself is already working against your skin's ability to hold on to water. And finally, remember that a small amount of brief tightness immediately after washing isn't automatically a red flag. It's really the persistence and severity of the sensation, especially alongside other barrier-related signs, that's more worth paying attention to, rather than every single moment of post-wash tightness being treated as a problem to solve. Understanding why skin feels tight after washing changes how you might interpret that sensation altogether. It's not proof of a job well done, it's not necessarily a sign your skin is clean, and it's certainly not evidence of some kind of purifying reaction. It's simply a common, explainable response tied to how surfactants, water temperature, technique, and even the surrounding environment interact with your skin's natural lipid barrier. One small piece of the much bigger picture of how your skin actually works, which is exactly what this channel is here to help you understand. The next time you feel that familiar tightness after washing, you'll hopefully think of it a little differently, not as a badge of a thorough cleanse, but simply as useful information your skin is giving you about how it's responding to your routine. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing to Skin Health Authority for more evidence-based skin education, explained clearly and without the guesswork.